Unemployed and Afraid acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this episode on and of the land where you, the listener, are tuning in from. We would like to pay our respects to elders past, present, and extend our respect to any First Nations, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today, acknowledging that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Welcome to Unemployed and Afraid, a podcast that explores the glorious mess of building your own business with the people doing it. I'm your host and fellow business builder, Kim Curtin. Thank you for being here. Let's get into some good, honest, small business chat. Hello, listener, and the biggest welcome to you for this episode of Unemployed and Afraid, the real feels about building a business and the surprising chaos that often comes along the way. If you, like me, are someone who left a corporate career to jump into business ownership and the general unknown/untethered vibe, you'll relate to the feeling of reminiscing over the good old days. You know, the days of regular salary and knowing which means you can live within or not. And maybe, like me, you've also flirted with full-time re-employment again, or just simply gone digging into the LinkedIn jobs section when things get really, really hard. It's a cloud that hangs around us for a number of reasons, and it's something that today's guest really understands. Dale is COO of Platinum Outsourcing, a business he joined as a partner, which provides us a super interesting perspective of stepping into business ownership in this way. Really cool too is we get to hear about how beneficial outsourcing can be for a small business and debunk a few myths about the industry of outsourcing offshore. You'll also hear about taking a business risk in the most formative years of your potential as an employee, the challenge of trying to build back to a salary you've been used to. I have to laugh at that, right? Like we have to laugh. Not falling into the entrepreneurial trap of working around the clock, evolving a business as it goes, learning to navigate business interests in a country other than your own, and selling when you're not a salesperson. I recently received a generous testimonial about the work I do for you on this pod, and they said the range of guests I interview are also very eclectic and interesting, embracing diversity in all its glory in terms of my curatorship of the show. Geez, I love that. And thank you to the person who gifted me that statement. You know who you are. As I strongly believe we learn the most from people in different business models, stages, and industries to our own, and particularly those we don't hear from often enough. So I know you're going to get a lot from this chat today. Let's get into it. I'm here with Dale Pearce, COO of Platinum Outsourcing, which is on a mission to help Australian businesses think outside the box by providing them with easy access to remote teams. Okay, so what does access to a remote team mean exactly? Well, it means providing access to designers, developers, engineers, and marketers that can help you with creative and development, experienced call center and email support staff, experienced accountants, bookkeepers, and payroll support, and a range of back office administrative talent for things like IT, data entry, logistics, and more. In November of 2022, Platinum Outsourcing was recognised by the Australian Financial Review as one of Australia's fastest growing companies, being featured on the AFR Fast Starters list, coming in at 88 on a list of 100. With a compound annual revenue growth rate of 111%. I do love the synchronicity of that number. As of today, they have customers across micro businesses, SME, MNC, and ASX-listed companies, and a huge growth trajectory. It's an incredibly interesting business offering that I'm sure has come with some pretty intense learnings and risk-taking moments. Dale, welcome to Unemployed and Afraid.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction. I couldn't have said it any better myself if I tried.
It's always the way whenever we try to explain our own businesses and what we do, that it's just like crickets, but getting somebody else to do it for you is helpful for sure. I would love to know, just to kick us off a little bit, to find out, how would your business partner, Tim, describe you?
Great question. Impatient, for sure. Yeah. as a single word, impatient. That's probably, Tim's a man of few words. And I think he'd admit that himself 100%. So yeah, if he was going to describe me, it would only be a single word. And I'm hoping that it would be anything worse than patient, but you never know.
I've often been described in the exact same way. In fact, just today, I was described as impatient. So I can understand that. I think there's a certain energy to driving a business forward that can encourage that feeling of impatience as well. So I feel a kindred spirit with that. But before we get into Platinum Outsourcing, who were you?
Before Platinum Outsourcing, I was involved in a few different entities prior to getting involved in the outsourcing industry. My last role prior to Platinum Outsourcing was an executive role with a Australian subsidiary of an Irish multinational company. I think I was there for 3 years. When I left, it was the Irish company who owned the business, but it had only been a year or so since they'd acquired the entity that I originally joined. So I came into that business and then was there for a couple of years, and then that business was sold on. And after that, that's when I involved with Platinum.
How did that come about, that first conversation with Platinum? How did it come into your world, your radar, and what did that whole process look like?
Yeah, so Tim, funnily enough, we met when I was in that particular position. He had another business on the west coast of Australia. It was an electrical contracting business, a very successful one. So part of what they did as part of their broader business was doing contractual work for certain products under warranty. And part of the role, or one of the responsibilities of my role when I was with the employment prior to joining Platinum, was being responsible for that network of contractors. So I met Tim through that business. He was actually doing the work for the company I was working for as the authorized service partner in that part of the country. So we met there, and he was actually already running at the time. It was a slightly different name. We've rebranded since then, but he had a very, very small outsourcing operation that was at that stage located in Indonesia only. And we ended up moving some roles across to that business. And that's essentially where the journey started. And that was the first time I'd met Tim. We didn't have a prior relationship to that. And that's how we got to know each other in the early days.
How did the conversation get started to starting to join this business? When did it kind of start to move relationship vibes?
Yeah, so Tim, when we first started discussing what my involvement would be in the business, initially it was Tim framing it as if he was looking for someone to come in and act as, I guess, what you call a business development representative or an SDR. There's lots of different names for them. I've never been involved in direct selling or business development. That's just not been my career journey. And most of the time, in fact, I've worked at the opposite end of the spectrum in after sales. So I usually am the one getting yelled at by the sales staff when something goes wrong with the customer they've just sold to. So that's where the discussion started. And I mentioned to Tim fairly early on that wasn't something that I was interested in pursuing. I was in a pretty decent position at the time. And as far as my career trajectory was concerned, I was pretty comfortable. I was heading in the right direction in that particular area that I was focused on, and I was relatively happy with what I was doing. And then over the course of a number of years, maybe not even a number of years, it might have been less than that, but the discussion evolved, and eventually it became a situation where Tim was willing to have me come into the business in a leadership capacity or a senior leadership capacity, and with the view of at some point getting an ownership stake. That again itself, that conversation evolved over many, many different iterations and took quite some time for us to agree on something that worked for him, his family, and then also for myself. But that was essentially the flavour of the discussion.
I think it's really interesting you raised there, worked for Tim and his family and also for you and yours. I think that's such an important aspect of joining in a business venture in any sort of joint capacity is how much it plays into your personal life as well, and the effect that it has not only on just what you're doing in the day-to-day and what you're building, but what that means for the broader family. It's such a different thing to consider than taking on a role in its traditional sense in any sort of corporate environment. And I imagine that it would have taken you a little while to get, I guess, almost emotionally comfortable with as well, stepping into this new type of way of working.
Yeah, I think in the early part, it was all new and shiny and really fun. But I think that sort of wore off pretty quickly, and the gravity of what it was going to take to actually make this worthwhile and make it something that there was good earning potential, I guess, to catch up to where I had been in my career prior to that. You know, the gravity of all of that started to hit pretty early on. And then it was only really 6 months, I think, that I joined Platinum Outsourcing was when COVID-19 hit. And, you know, for anyone that knows anything about what a BPO company does, a business process outsourcing company, is we build remote teams offshore. So you can't fly anywhere. So you're dealing with the complexities of that and having no idea what the world was going to look like after that, like everyone. And you've just, I guess, stepped into an entrepreneurial role in a very small business that's not making very much money at all. Yeah, it was a weird time, just compounded by the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic as well.
Wasn't that a good time? I still feel like it's just compartmentalized somewhere in the back of my brain now. Just did that happen? Sure. No, that didn't happen, did it? I think a lot of business people in any kind of business, be it micro to where you're at, to whatever's happening in the middle, that aspect of needing to crawl back to the salary that you've been used to and the difference in sensation when you kind of like, you start doing the sums when you're like, all right, I'm going to go out and work for myself and yep, cool. Like I should be able to build it to here. And, this is kind of what I'm used to. It's all right. I'll take a bit of a step back now and it'll grow. And then once you're actually sitting in that, it's like, oof, it's a quite heavy feeling. I mean, I've been now at this for, when did I leave? January 2020 was when I left my corporate role. And now here we are. It's late 2023 and I'm still nowhere near, what I used to earn as a corporate employee and just trying to piece things together. And you're right in that becomes a sense of gravity. For me, it's been at times clouding in terms of decision making and the ability to step forward with certain things. How has that experience been for you in terms of finding it like within yourself, finding the energy and the decision making trust to move forward with what you're growing, with that trust behind it?
Yeah, I think also too, it's a good point regarding the salary, because that's, I suppose, the most glaring thing for you to look at, right? So if you've come from a role, whatever it is, and you were earning X amount per year and you decide to go into something entrepreneurial, whether you're a founder or you're coming in, I guess, as a business partner, as an equity partner and taking a reduced salary or whatever that is, that's one part of it. But another way I look at it as well, which I think of often just as much as the earning potential part is, I'm 38 now, so I think I would have been 33 or 34 when I came into the business, and I really feel like people that are successful and are able to get financial freedom later in life, be comfortable in retirement and have the option to retire earlier, those that they're really building that career. In my experience, the most formative years for those people are in their 30s, particularly the back end of your 30s. So once I started to get into it, not only was I focused on trying to provide for my family and get my salary back to where it was and make the business profitable, but also I'm mindful of the fact that if this takes too long to get to it, or if it does fail after 4 or 5 years, because it realistically it's going to take 5, 6, 7 years to be something that's worthwhile. If something does go wrong 4 or 5 years into it, I've really lost a big part of my career where I would have been potentially making some moves to get myself in a better position later on. So I suppose there was the salary aspect of it, and there was that career trajectory part of it as well. So to go back to your question regarding decision making, something you mentioned at the start of the podcast when we started recording was how would Tim, my business partner, describe me? And it's impatient, and that's because I think that those things are always in the forefront of my mind. And I realized that time is limited and you've got to, make hay while the sun shines, so to speak. So you've just got to get in and try to get things done as quickly as you can. Yeah, if you want to get somewhere.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. You and I are snap exactly the same age. And yeah, it's something I think about quite a bit, which is, you're always really able to go back into a corporate space if something doesn't work out. But yes, it is that time and that being on the boots on ground in any kind of role that is lost as part of that. So I understand that. I feel like I'm seeing a little bit of my impatience mirrored back and understanding that aspect of the process and what that brings on to you. And I think that also brings up for me a little bit of that balance challenge. And I want to get back to your growth plan and what that was looking like at this stage and not take us too far off course, but I do love a tangent. But, finding that sense of balance when you're trying to grow something with a bit of impatience behind it, like there's a lot of energy, just like, oh, we've got to make hay while the sun shines. How do you approach then going through that and making moves and working hard with maintaining a little bit of sense of self and maintaining a little bit of balance, which you don't often get to have in these gigs?
That's a really good question. And I'm certain you hear all these crazy stories about entrepreneurs working 12 hours a day and 7 days a week. And that's something I've never done. And I don't think I'll ever do. Fingers crossed. Number one, I just don't think I could do it physically. I'm not built that way. I'm someone that tends to get up reasonably early and I tend to do my best work early in the morning. And come this time of the afternoon, we're recording this now, it's 1:30 in the afternoon. I find once I sort of get past 3 p.m. in the afternoon, I'm not going to be productive, and I'm not going to produce anything that resembles good work after that time. But what I will say is when I am working for those 8, 9, 10 hours a day, I'm going at 100%, and I'm not taking coffee breaks, or I'm not going and sitting on the lounge on my phone. I don't have social media outside of LinkedIn. I'm really focused in those 5 days a week, 8 hours a day that I'm actually getting things done. Going back to your question, maintaining that sense of self. Well, I have always been someone that my identity is very closely attached to my success in whatever it is that I'm doing at the time, whether that's in a professional sense or something outside of that. So by way of my personality type, I think I have a very hard time separating who I am at Platinum Outsourcing and who I am as Dale, the dad or the partner. But in terms of, I suppose, maintaining some sanity, I live close to the beach. I'm not far from you, where you are on the Sunshine Coast. We're down here on the Tweed Coast. So I try to get in the ocean as often as possible. I have a martial arts hobby, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I try to be there 3 times a week. It's sometimes not possible with the way things are at the moment. And just try to do things that are, I guess, allow the opportunity to completely switch off from work. And surfing and Jiu-Jitsu are 2 sports that are really, really good at bringing you into the present moment. I think it's called mindfulness. I don't know. It's one of those things that it's kind of a buzzword, but it sort of allows you to clear everything out of your head and just be focused on what it is that you're doing at that point in time. Outside of those couple of things, when I'm with my kids would probably be the only other time because they're 100 miles an hour. But I'd say every other moment I've got my eyes open, even when I've got my eyes closed, I think it's probably living and breathing the business, which isn't a bad thing. I enjoy what I do. So, but yeah, I am mindful of it as well.
Yeah, super important insights there in terms of finding something you can do that takes your entire attention away from the business, because you're right, it's so hard to turn off even when something grabs your eye on the telly and it's like, oh, actually that could be a really good lead for this, and you're writing it down, and yeah, it's just kind of endless. So I think that's excellent advice. I want to go back to, I guess, that building phase. So you've stepped into this business and you've taken this exciting risk on and you're growing, and then old mate COVID decides to show up. What did the growth plan look like at that stage, and how was it going?
Yeah, I don't know if you'd probably associate the word plan and Platinum Outsourcing that early on, using them in the same sentence, to be honest. When COVID hit, as I said earlier, I think it was about 6 months before I joined the business. So I was still well and truly in the trying to figure out how this industry works, who the players are, what our margins look like, where we price ourselves, how we go to market in general. So I was still in the very, very early part of trying to get the business into some type of mode to actually be truly customer facing. Prior to me joining, we did have some customers, but Tim wasn't outwardly really promoting the businesses as a BPO company and was going to be something of any size at all. It was really some people in the industry that had heard he was supporting his own business through outsourcing. They became interested. He was making some good money from it, certainly not millions of dollars, but a nice little additional profit for not a huge amount of effort or inertia that was required on his part. So then when I came in, there wasn't really any game plan or plans laid for where we were going to go or what even the business was going to be. So then COVID happened, and I guess the plans that we had for the business at that point, much like everyone else, was just trying to survive and trying to understand where our risk was in terms of our existing customer base, who we thought we could continue to serve. Because obviously the complexity with what we were doing over in Asia is they were in lockdown as well. So we're trying to figure out how we can continue to operate, because obviously the infrastructure in Asia in terms of their ability to go and work from home, most of these people are living in shared accommodation, or they're living with a large number of family members, sometimes in a single bedroom dwelling or a studio dwelling with very, very limited internet connectivity. So yeah, it was an interesting time. So it was probably during that COVID period, particularly that first year, when really all of the planning around what we were going to do, where we were going to go, what we wanted the business to look like in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That's when all of that happened, because we had nothing else to do, essentially. We were treading water, reading the news in Indonesia, because we were only operating in Indonesia at the time. And this is when we formulated the plan to then open our office and create a presence in the Philippines.
It would have been a lot to get used to at that phase. So first working in this business, dealing with everything else that was going on externally, but then also learning to work with people that are working overseas and different contexts, different lifestyles, different backgrounds, different cultures, just everything like that. And the scale of which you were connecting with people, I imagine that would have been quite an interesting journey.
Yeah, and I think in terms of learning how to manage teams in other cultures and that type of thing, Indonesia's obviously one of our closest neighbours in terms of geography, but you couldn't pick a country that's more far from us in terms of the cultural differences. And then on top of that, we then went and opened in the Philippines. Are probably culturally a little bit closer to Australia than what Indonesia is. It certainly presented some challenges there as well. And then just also to operating at it, we've got we're Australian customer base. We've now got an operation in Indonesia. So different time zone to the Philippines, different time zone to Australia. You've got different labour relations laws in Indonesia versus the labour relations laws in the Philippines. You've got different rates of pay. You've got different language, completely different culturally in terms of how you performance manage, discipline, incentivize, right down to what we're doing for end of year events and everything else. There's a completely different way in which you interact with the team. So that's been an enormous learning curve. I started getting tutored in Tagalog, which is the Filipino language, about 18 months ago.
How's that going?
Yeah, I was about to say, don't ask me to say too much. It's quite a difficult language to learn, but also to just having the brain power to, I guess, invest in trying to learn a language, which is something you can't really half-ass. Excuse my language. But no, I'm getting there. I'm doing it a little bit more. My team in the Philippines find it quite funny. They just, whenever you're there and you try to speak the language, everyone just laughs at you when you're trying to talk it. So you don't know if you've said the right thing or if you've said the wrong thing or if they're just laughing. I don't know. But yeah, I'm not sure if that answered you. I think I went off on a tangent there. I know you said you like tangents. So
I do love a tangent. I think that's when the best stories come out. How did you market the business to your Australian customers of all those ranges of sizes? I mean, that's SMEs, micros, right up there. They're all very different. How did you get your service offering out there?
So really early on in the very early days, so the initial part of the business we had, which is when we were talking to, just so people have an understanding of the scale, when we first started, we were turning over sort of monthly recurring revenue, which is probably more of a SaaS term, but that's kind of how we measure ourselves as well. The monthly recurring revenue is very, very low, 5 figures. And all of that revenue was generated from people that were referrals by Tim that, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, that were in the same industry as Tim, that were interested in what he was doing, and they would dip in their toe into outsourcing, predominantly from a back office perspective. Very basic back office stuff, some invoicing and billing, no technical accountancy or anything like that. So you probably call it data entry. So when I joined, how we won customers was purely cold outreach, which again was what I mentioned earlier, that I'm not a salesperson. I've never been a fan of it. So that was quite a difficult thing to do. So we were reaching out to people via LinkedIn, which has become unbelievably saturated now. So we don't do that anymore. And I just know myself, I don't know, maybe if because I've got more followers now or connections or my titles changed, but I know when I started with Platinum, I wasn't getting really any inbound messages on LinkedIn for people trying to sell me things. And that's how we were reaching out to people. So we're just sending a cold DM. I'd pick a profile of the people we wanted to try to connect with. I'd send them a cold message. Outsourcing is not something people it's not like you can telemarket someone and say, hey, do you want to outsource your whole back office of 100 staff? Oh yeah, let's do it. That's not really how it works, but cold outreach on LinkedIn. And we got some good traction with that. But then I noticed once we came out of the pandemic, and I think I'm just assuming this, but I think because remote work had become such a big thing, you started to see all these SDRs move away from being on the road or being on the phone or whatever it was. And a lot of companies started to build these large inside sales teams that were doing stuff without being out on the road. So it felt to me like all of a sudden I went from never getting any LinkedIn messages from people selling me things to all of a sudden getting lots of them. And even today I get tons and tons and tons of them. So I can understand as someone that gets a lot of them, and I do try to reply to some of them. I just made the decision that we weren't going to do that anymore. I just don't think that you get the penetration. So from there, thankfully, as all this was happening and we're figuring out what we're going to do, we're winning business through referrals and just organic growth from existing partners. I think by and large, most outsourcing companies, those that are starting to scale, most of the time, the ones that are successful and get to that 500 to 1,000 seats, it's through organic growth and through referral. Again, because outsourcing is a big ticket item and people aren't just making decisions on a whim. And then the rest, and the quality is not great, the rest is through paid advertising on Google AdWords. And I'm sure we probably get some referral-based stuff that comes from our marketing, LinkedIn and that type of thing.
I know what you mean about LinkedIn in terms of the inbound mail, the volume of emails I get from podcast promoters That's my favorite. I didn't even know podcast promoters were a thing up until a few months ago. And all of a sudden, I get just absolutely bombarded with them. And I can't help it. I mean, the purist in me is like, hang on, if I'm getting all of these emails, that means podcasters are using this service. And so, we're talking promoting, quote unquote, with downloads and listens and things like that. I'm just like, hang on a minute, what's happening here? This is concerning. We need real engagement. We need all of those things here. It's not something I'm interested in. But anyway, that's me going on a rant about podcast promoters. But yes, I feel you. It has shifted a little bit. I have two questions for you. And I think one should precede the other, because I think there's some misconceptions that I'm sure you have to debunk quite often with people that you're cold outreaching to that could really see a great benefit with this. So I want to talk a little bit about what I guess you wish more people knew about outsourcing. But before that, I would love you to tell me a little bit about some of the success stories you've seen. And I think particularly for those in a, SME or a micro sort of level, some of the success stories of people you've partnered with who've been using the services of outsourcing.
Yeah. So once we get new partners coming to us and we onboard them and they start working with us, the amount of customers that start with, you're talking about, micro businesses or SME that start with a single resource, it could be anything, an accountant, a virtual assistant or whatever it is, e-commerce support. I'd say it'd be 95 to 99% of those people that started with us with one have built from there and continued to grow throughout their journey with us. It's very, very rare that we get someone come in and they find that it's not for them or they have a poor experience.
I'm incredibly fascinated by the service. Just generally, I'm always really interested in anything that helps businesses grow, and particularly those in micro and SME territory to be able to keep doing what they do and actually grow. What do you wish more people knew about outsourcing?
There's probably a lot of things I could say here, but that it's not just for big business. I think that's a common misconception that when you talk about outsourcing, people think, they're moving Telstra's moving a call center to India, or so-and-so healthcare companies moving their claims processing to the Philippines. And that's not the case anymore. And there is more exposure, as I said, with micro businesses and SME now, because you have freelance platforms like Upwork, or I think Fiverr is another one. And they're going out and they're utilizing these freelancers. But for some reason, freelancing is not associated with outsourcing, but they're essentially one and the same, right? You're using a freelancer, you're outsourcing some work. We essentially do the same thing, but we give you longevity with the same person who's employed by us with all the benefits associated with full-time employment. They're looked after. We make sure that their portion and our portion of taxes are paid, so it helps the economy in the Philippines and all the social services that are fed by that money. And also, too, you retain your IP. So if you're going to to take your example, Kim, if you're a podcast host and you're a podcast producer, and you go and use a freelancer to cut up your podcast, and you spend a lot of time working with this freelancer on the type of edits you like, the type of sound quality you like, the type of socials that you want clipped from your podcast, and you put all this time into that person, there's no incentive for that freelancer to stay with you long term. As far as they're concerned, you're $250 a month to them, and then they've got Joe Blogs down the road that's paying them $250, and then they've got so-and-so in the US that's paying them $250. So as far as they're concerned, where they jump to next is probably going to be a result of someone paying them slightly more. And then all of that IP goes along with them, and all that time that you put into them goes with them as well. Now, that's not to say that doesn't happen with full-time employees either, but certainly I think those that are in full-time employment, particularly in the Philippines or in Indonesia, they're incentivized to stay by the conditions of the workplace that they're employed within. And that's why you see outsourcing and BPO companies like us have amazing programs in terms of, private healthcare. They've got stocked fridge, stocked pantry, paid incentives above and beyond their salary and allowances and everything else, regular team events, all these things that you even see in Australian businesses, because we're trying to create an environment where there is longevity and show people the benefit versus perhaps using a freelancer or everything else. But yeah, what I would say is that would be the biggest thing, is outsourcing is not just for big business. It is very much achievable and accessible to micro businesses, and there's lots of tradespeople now using VAs and small e-commerce shops using e-commerce VAs or sales support and everything else. So that would probably be the one thing I'd like to get across.
Yeah, I love that. Always looking for those opportunities to help people grow. I think it's brilliant. But You've mentioned, I guess, a couple of times since we've been chatting, and it's sparked an interest for me, is that, it kind of sounds like Platinum Outsourcing was right there at the beginning of this, I guess, industry taking form and getting a little bit more known in market. So, sales processes start to get a little bit easier. Naturally, that means you've got competitors popping up in the space. And as a business looking to grow yourself through this and make it a great decision for your business partner, for you, for your families, and for the growth of everybody that you're working with. How are you dealing with competitors coming into the space, and what's your approach to them?
Yeah, so I'd say we definitely weren't around for that first wave of when things really took off. I mean, the Philippine BPO industry has probably been around for the better part of 2 decades. So you saw the industry first really start to take shape there during the dot-com era, and then the dot-com burst and everything else. And then I believe it was I wrote a blog on this just recently, so I should know, like, it was literally the timeline of the BPO industry, and I'm trying to give the timeline, I've forgotten everything. So
it's always the way.
Perfect. But then there was a period where there was a lot of larger Australian businesses moving call centers offshore. So Telstra established initially they used a BPO like us, and then they established their own company-owned operation in the Philippines, which usually a lot of these bigger guys do. They'll use a company like us first. They'll figure out the lay of the land, and then once they know it works, they'll incorporate their own entity. So they've got the full control, and there's obviously a lot of cost saving for them as well because they're not paying us a margin. But I'd say we were probably part of the third, fourth, or fifth wave, and I think that wave was what happened after COVID, and that really just cemented the fact that you can have teams working remotely and you can collaborate remotely. I mean, I don't recall, maybe you've been, you're a podcaster, so you're probably a bit more savvy on technology. I don't even recall what software I used to talk to people on video chat before the pandemic. I don't even know if I did do that, to be perfectly honest. So, a lot of things changed when COVID happened. And one of those was the rise of remote work and the understanding, or the realization rather, that we can make remote teams work. And that then, was a segue to then us being able to say, hey, guess what? We've got remote teams for you. We've got thousands of them, and they're a bunch cheaper, just as reliable and just as skilled as onshore workforce. And in terms of competitors and how we manage that, outsourcing is a big ticket item. So it's not easy to win customers. Like, it's relatively low barriers to entry if you want to start. If you've got a little bit of money, you can pay to incorporate a company. You don't necessarily need a premises. You can offer remote work for your team and go to market as a remote only outsourcing provider. But you need to either have a niche or have an inroad into an industry where people already trust you to get them to make the decision to outsource to you. Because if you just start a brand, if I start Dale's outsourcing company today and I don't know anyone, and I create a LinkedIn profile and I start going out and talking to people and businesses, whether they're mum and dad operations or solopreneurs or they're a multinational company, no one's going to come and do business with me if I've got 2 or 3 staff. The first question you get asked is, how many staff do you have? So I think in terms of the barrier to entry in terms of cost is relatively low, but it's hard to get to that first 20, 30, 40, 50. And I think a lot of people that get into it give up. But I think once you get past that initial 50 staff, I believe, and fingers crossed for me and for Tim, but fingers crossed that the sky's kind of the limit for us now. You start to get that momentum and you start to get that organic growth without having to beg, plead and steal for every customer. We don't steal customers, we beg and plead.
No, totally hear that. I'm part of quite a lot of business groups, across different corners of the internet. So I see quite a bit of discourse around outsourcing and working with people who are based in the Philippines or elsewhere. And I always find that discourse quite interesting because there's usually very 2 distinct camps. And I guess it's those people who, really understand the value and also the context of salary differences, and those who don't. So those who come from a context of Australian salaries and what's, fair and reasonable on Australian shores, and then looking at, what's fair and reasonable on an offshore salary, and then not piecing the 2 together. So I'm doing a roundabout way of saying I watch a lot of discourse where people argue with each other, saying like it's horrible to pay someone that, and then someone say, hang on a minute, you've got to put this into context. This is absolutely the regular salary here, and this is what it means for the context of the local community and how their economics works. Could you talk to me a little bit about that and help explain it for anybody who might not really understanding it in context to the location?
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one because I mean, if you're someone that's done any type of traveling anywhere in the world, that's kind of the equivalent of that school of thought is like if you went to a foreign country and walked into a shop. So I'll use like Europe as an example, right? Because you always buy bottles of water when you're in Europe because you only go to Europe in summer, right? Because that's the best time. But you'll buy like a bottle of water for like 60 cents or €1, right? You know, would you pay the street vendor the Australian equivalent of what a bottle of water cost at BP? That's essentially the equivalent argument that, oh, no, you should be paying the equivalent. Well, you go to any country and find anybody in any business, and then you should start paying them the equivalent of what you think that product is worth in Australia. That's the cost of living is vastly different across lots of different countries, and Southeast Asia is no exception. We're very, very lucky in Australia that we've got a certain standard of living, but also that's not to say that, as I said, that the cost of living is much lower in the Philippines, and that's the reason that the rate of pay matches that. And the outsourcing industry has been there for 20 years. It's effectively created a middle class. There was no middle class. It was either the uber wealthy or the absolute poorest of the poor that you would see anywhere in the world. And it's created an economy within an economy. It contributes, I think, 15% of gross domestic product, which is absolutely enormous. And it's created a middle class for that country. So it's really a non-argument. Doesn't make any sense from a financial perspective if you understand the way the economy works and that type of thing and cost of living. So
yeah, thank you for clarifying that to put things into context. And like you said, the price of let alone the price of water at BP. What about the price of the airport? Let's just talk about that.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's all context.
I go shopping now, and I swear a few years ago I could do a 1 week. We do food shopping once a week, right? You could do 1 week of food shopping. It would cost us maybe $200, right? And that wouldn't be 7 nights of meals or whatever, but it'd be 5 nights. We'd get a fair bit of stuff. I go to the shops now if we've forgotten dinner one night, and I'll get like a dinner for the kids with some vegetables and some meat or whatever, and maybe, I don't know, 1 or 2 things for the next day, and it's $70 or $80. It's up. It's just insane. Mm-hmm. But also too, just going back to I think also people think that like Filipinos or Indonesians in our case as well get paid a couple of bucks here and there. Gone are the days where there was no minimum wage, or you had these cowboys running around there that were paying people peanuts. It's a highly regulated industry, and to be perfectly frank, Indonesia is probably is definitely the exception of two. The labour laws in the Philippines, the most insane thing you've ever dealt with in your life as a Westerner. It's so heavily skewed to Filipinos that it actually makes it really, really difficult to do business there a lot of the time. And if you ever did a Filipino wrong as a Western-owned company, as a foreign investor, you're going to find out very, very quick what happens, and you'll get a really, really big slap. And also, so some of the roles that we've got with full stack developers and stuff, some of these guys are not far off the salary I pay myself to be, and I'm being dead serious. So these people aren't getting paid peanuts. They're getting paid fairly for the work. And we pay above market anyway, because the only way you get people and keep good people is you've got to pay them more than what they're worth. Otherwise, someone else is going to come along and take them from you. So
absolutely. No, really important context to provide. So hopefully we've given that for anyone who was unsure. Where do you hope to see things grow to now? You're sort of coming out that other side. That glass ceiling is looking to be pretty smashed, and things are starting to get that traction towards that glorious 5-6 year mark that we're all crawling towards. Where do you hope to see it grow to eventually?
That's a great question. I think for Tim and I won't speak for Tim because obviously he's not here, but certainly for me, I remember distinctly speaking to people on the phone for the first time and saying, look, we don't want to be a 1,000 seat or 5,000 seat. We want to get to 200 head count and see how things go from there, because we still want to be involved in the business and everything else. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, if I get to 200 full-time staff, like you obviously back yourself, but in the back of my head, I'm thinking that's a long way off, and I don't know how I'm going to get it to there because we're only probably 25 or 30 staff. Thinking back to the time that I was saying that type of thing. I think for us, our next goal is to 200 headcount, and this financial goals as well. But we're a funny business, and our business is our people. So obviously, headcount directly relates to our revenue, and whereas sometimes that's not necessarily the case in other businesses. But we're in the business of offering to build remote teams. So for us, I think we've ticked over into the triple digits now. So the next goal would be to 200, and our goal is to get to that in the next less than 18 months. So it's taken us, I've been in the business 4.5 years to get to 100. We're going to try and get from 100 to 200 in 18 months.
Amazing. I mean, that's a lot of people to work with, and that sounds really exciting. I was so looking forward to this chat because I knew it was going to deliver on two really important things. Like one, which is a business journey story, which is 100% what we're here for, the personal journey, the chaoticness of what it's like to build a business at any level, at any stage. But it's also been a really, I think, important conversation around how business owners can get themselves a little bit more resourced. Particularly, I'm thinking of, a few of my listeners who I'm in regular contact with who are at that tipping point of my business can grow, but I physically cannot do any more work and therefore I'm holding the business back.
Yep.
This has been a really important conversation to perhaps help those people take a step in the right direction to free themselves up to help grow the business as well. So thank you for delivering on that. In return, how can the listener and I support you?
Oh, you can start outsourcing. No, listen, all I would say is if you wanted to support us and support our industry is if you do get cold outreach, we don't do it anymore, right? So if you don't want to deal with someone that doesn't do cold outreach, feel free to get in touch with us. But if you do get cold outreach from someone and you have considered outsourcing before or whatever, just have a chat with them and learn a little bit about what it is that we do. As I said, it's a really big and important part of the Philippines economy and a really big part of employing a really enormous amount of talented and really, really lovely people in both the Philippines and Indonesia. So don't, I guess, dismiss it on the basis of you feel like people aren't being treated the right way. If you partner with a reputable BPO company like ourselves, and there's plenty of us out there, particularly some really, really good Australian companies, they really do care and look after their staff. And it's something that's very important to Tim and I, that we look after people the right way and treat people like we want to be treated. So yeah, just engage with an outsourcing provider and learn a little bit about what it is that we do. And a rising tide lifts all boats. So if you're supporting our industry, then I'm all for it. If it's not us, then that's all good.
Amen to the rising tide. One of my favorite quotes. I've been using and overusing at the moment because I couldn't agree more. It's so important. Dale, you have shared so much today. So thank you for spending the time, for all of your insights. And I'm going to make sure to have a link to your website and the show notes as well, your LinkedIn, your social media of choice, and the listener can go and connect with you. Thank you for spending the time with me today. It's been great.
Thanks a lot for having me, Kim. And congratulations on the podcast. Maybe we can talk again in like another 4 years or something and we'll both be like sitting on super yachts or something, right?
100%. Let's pop it in the diary for now.
Thanks, Kim. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Unemployed and Afraid, the podcast for small business builders with your host, me, Kim Curtin. If you love it, you can say thanks with a star rating and a review. And of course, join the community on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Find us at Unemployed and Afraid wherever you're hanging out, and I'll see you there.